Welcome to Back to the Texts Themselves, a series on phenomenology. Today's video covers sections 23 to 29 of Husserl's Cartesian Meditations. The third meditation is a short section wherein we return to the concept of evidence, considering its modifications in light of the notion of synthesis. Husserl also makes important distinctions and orderings of terms that depart from Heidegger and Sartre in particular. And as we'll see, such differences disclose a theme discovered throughout the third meditation, which is Husserl's apparent prioritization of being and the necessary essential structure of things over non-being and the contingency of existence. Husserl begins the third meditation by defining terms and drawing relations among concepts. Reason is defined as an all-embracing, necessary structural form belonging to transcendental subjectivity. It entails the possibility of verification, by which Husserl means arriving at evidence. Let's recall that evidence entails a manner of a mental seeing or grasping of something in itself. It is a correspondence or resonance between the intending judgment and the given intuition, or a synthesis between what is meant and the actual meaning of a given state of affairs. Now, in section 24, Husserl defines evidence as a universal primal phenomenon of intentional life, the quite preeminent mode of consciousness that consists in the self-appearance, the self-exhibition, the self-giving of an affair complex, a universality, a value, or other objectivity. He adds that evidence is always a possibility of conscious life, but not a necessity. So how is this the case? How is evidence both a universal primal phenomenon of intentional life, but is also not a necessity of that life? The seeming contradiction is resolved once we consider that consciousness is always tending toward evidence through a process of verification. This tending toward the possibility of evidence is that essential trait of intentional life rather than its actualization being that, which sometimes is achieved and other times not. Consequently, this tending toward evidence can sometimes be negated and the original intentionality nullified. For example, while composing this script, my wife called to ask if my daughter was 5 feet tall. I guess it was related to purchasing clothing or something. And thinking about it, I imagined my daughter standing next to me and pictured her height relative to my own and provided the judgment that, yes, indeed, I believe she is 5 feet tall. However, when she came home, it turned out that she was a bit less than that. And so my original intention, my judgment I made concerning her height, failed to reach an adequate fulfilling intuition and thus was rendered devoid of meaningful content that could correspond to the ment of my intention. Now, there's nothing profound in that observation, but what does become somewhat more interesting in my eyes is what Husserl then does with this nullity. Nullity, or non-being, is rendered a derivative modality of a simple, certain being, which is considered primary. This converges with what he states in section 23, wherein he claims that reason belongs to being and unreason to non-being. This struck me as a glaring difference from Heidegger, whose position might be a direct inversion of this idea. For Heidegger, being emerges out of nothing, and our confrontation with the nullity of being relativizes its meaning and opens us to new unactualized possibilities. And this is why Heidegger prioritizes the future, not the present. The future is what is not yet. Nonetheless, all things arrive and have their being from the nothingness of this future. Section 25 makes further distinctions. The first is between actuality and phantasy, or what Husserl calls as-if actuality. What is notable about phantasy is that objective being is no longer its concern. It doesn't participate in the same mode of spatiality and temporality that belongs to material beings. As such, the kind of evidence appropriate to phantasy changes. Related to this is a second distinction between positionality and quasi-positionality. Positionality concerns the act of positing an object. A positing act intends objects as actually existing. whether I posit that object through believing, valuing, willing, etc. Yet, as a phenomenological observation, it's essential to note that to say something exists is to merely say that an object is accepted by me. It's not quite yet the moment of evidence for its existence. Now, in case you are wondering why we're even bothering with the matter of existence when you might have thought that the epoche brackets this, let me briefly clarify. When I approach an object phenomenologically, I do not concern myself with the source of its being in the sense of its objective causes or the nature of its inherent materiality, whether, for example, it's composed of carbon or iron atoms. I merely describe the object as it gives itself over to my lived experience. Yet, and here's the twist, one aspect of my experience of some objects concerns whether they exist. That existence is thought first phenomenologically rather than metaphysically. It's the difference between claiming something actually exists out there in the world versus describing how things appear to me as actually existing out there in the world. It's a subtle but critical distinction here, as there is a notable difference between objects posited as truly existing and objects wherein that's not of concern, such as with quasi-positionality and fantasy. So, quasi-positionality then is the intentionality associated with fantasy, wherein something is intended in the mode of the as-if. Quasi-positing acts present objects in a modified form without any commitment to an actual existence. They are merely presented as such. By calling the intentionality directed toward fantasy a quasi-positionality, it seems to me to reinforce the priority Husserl accords to actually existing objects, of being over non-being. Fantasy, while not nothing, still lacks a kind of presence that materially existing objects have for me and is perhaps, like non-being, a derivative mode of such objects. This is further supported by the fact that elsewhere Husserl considers fantasy to be a mere modification of perception rather than its own fundamental form of consciousness, an idea which Sartre will later critique him for. It should also be noted that Husserl distinguishes fantasy from image consciousness, the latter being rooted in the perception of a present object wherein we encounter, through imaginal free variation, the adumbrations or profiles of that object presently absent. A question that came up for me here is about Husserl's thinking around ideal objects, such as what we find in mathematics and geometry. Are these on par with objects of fantasy? If that was the case, it would be very confusing because Husserl upholds these ideal objects as eminently reasonable. But that isn't the case. Whereas fantasy is conceived of as an image derivative of perception, ideal or formal objects are not images at all. They're pure essences marked by their universality and necessary character, even though they do not entail positing their existence. Yet, all things that exist, in a certain sense, cannot be thought without presupposing these essences, even if we're only vaguely aware of them, or even perhaps not at all. The architects of ancient buildings needed not to be aware of certain geometric principles, despite those principles being a necessary precondition for the construction of those buildings. In sum, all these distinctions are made to help us consider the formal structure and laws of conscious life that go into intentional analysis, and to show how some objects we posit in terms of existence and others we don't posit in terms of existence. However, to accept an object as existing is not yet to say anything substantive about evidence. For we can posit something as existing only to discover it to not be the case. So what then permits certainty toward the actuality of something? How is it that something comes into evidence? For there to be evidence of the truly existing object, there must be what Husserl calls an abiding possession, whereby every evidence can constantly be revisited, providing new evidence that reinstitutes the first evidence. Collectively, they form a horizon of potentiality that I can always return to. Only from this horizon of potentiality is it possible to behold a fixed and abiding being, a being whose being is posited and is always found supported, and thereby allows for an endless return to this evidence. The establishment of truth in empirical sciences is not through one study finding a statistically significant causal relationship, but in repeating that finding in research that replicates the original study. However, this notion of evidence does not apply merely to this mode of knowledge, but to all forms of positing. If I judge my friend as trustworthy, I discover the evidence for the truthfulness of this judgment every time I confide in him when he keeps my words confidential. These repetitions of evidence form horizons of potentiality that surrounds the givenness of the state of affairs, that being my trustworthy friend. This horizon of potential evidences that is infinitely repeatable is what Husserl calls the in itself of actually existing objects. He contrasts this with the for me of particular acts, and he claimed that true being is always in reference to the in itself, which concerns certain potentialities grounded in the transcendental ego. So we have here another possible contrast, this time with Sartre, whose distinction between the in itself and the for itself bears some resemblance to Husserl's distinction here. For Sartre, the in itself refers to the intrinsic being of the object of consciousness, but the for itself communicates a relation. Consciousness, though potentially considered an in itself, is defined primarily in relation to something else, for itself, and never simply an in itself, other than through a mode of abstraction that artificially posits an essence preceding its existence. For Sartre, this for itself is revealed in the freedom of choosing what consciousness will be in relation to, and as such marks a negation of the in itself. So we can see here, much like with Heidegger inverting the priority of non-being over being, it may be the case that Sartre is coming here to invert the priority Husserl places on the in itself, putting instead in its place the negating power of the for itself. Despite what the in itself might suggest, Husserl does not mean to suggest that achieving it is ever complete. As with the example of the trustworthiness of a friend, this evidence always refers to an infinity of evidences. And such evidence is never complete since it deals with what Husserl calls a multiform horizon of unfulfilled anticipations. Such imperfect evidence increasingly approximates perfection, but never reaches completion, since an absolute perfect evidence entails a synthesis whereby an adequate fulfillment of every particular evidence is obtained of every possible intention. That would not mean the impossible situation of producing all this evidence simultaneously, but instead clarifies the object's essential internal structure that composes its ideal infinite syntheses of this evidence. So let me state that otherwise. It is a clarifying of the intrinsic rationality that governs the very logic of the object. So although I might not behold simultaneously every conceivable actualization of Isaac Newton's second law of motion, the internal structure of this formula provides the ideal infinite synthesis of every possible intention. However, achieving such an internal structure for most objects is, Husserl admits, a quite definite and tremendous task, something that seems accomplished only in the domain of ideal objects and not material ones. And this highlights the unique challenge of dealing with material regions rather than merely formal logical categories. Acquiring such perfect evidence for objects within material regions requires a synthesis that incorporates no less than the totality of the objective world itself. And so this will, in turn, Husserl claims, require the need for a theory of physical nature, of the human being, of human community, of culture, etc. So we can see how Husserl now is leading us into an important transitional moment in the text. Mostly when he's talked about evidence and constitutive syntheses, it's been primarily about isolated objects. Now he shows how a comprehensive phenomenological analysis will need to go well beyond this supposedly isolated object and the supposedly isolated solipsistic ego, to show how the horizons of potentiality in our constitutive syntheses leads us to take up a phenomenology of the world and a phenomenology of intersubjectivity, both of which make up a good portion of what will come in the Cartesian Meditations. If you found this video helpful and it's within your means, please consider making a super thank you tip. You can find the super thank you button below this video. If you wish to be an ongoing supporter of this channel, you can do so on Patreon, where I offer video transcripts and unedited materials. The link is below. I want to thank the following for already supporting this channel on Patreon. You can also support this channel by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. And as always, thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.